The courtroom went silent the moment my father slammed his fist on the table. His face was red, veins bulging at his temples, and his finger was pointed directly at my younger sister Nicole, who sat trembling in the witness chair. The bailiff moved forward instinctively, but Judge Hartwell raised her hand, eyes narrowing behind her glasses as she watched the scene unfold. "You ungrateful little liar," my father hissed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" Nicole's lips quivered. She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. I watched from the gallery, my chest tightening with a familiar rage that I'd spent 34 years learning to swallow. But not today. Not anymore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood up. The wooden bench creaked beneath me, and every head in that courtroom turned in my direction. My father's lawyer shot me a warning glare. The court reporter paused mid-keystroke. Even the judge tilted her head slightly, waiting. I didn't sit back down. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter I'd been writing for 3 weeks. 5 pages of documentation, timelines, bank statements, and the kind of truth that people like my father spend their entire lives trying to bury. I walked down the aisle, my heels clicking against the tile floor, and approached the bench. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I have something the court needs to see." Judge Hartwell looked at me for a long moment, then at my father, whose expression had shifted from fury to panic. She took the envelope from my hand, broke the seal, and began to read. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. And then, something happened that I will never forget for as long as I live. Judge Patricia Hartwell, a woman known throughout Riverside County for her stern demeanor and zero tolerance for nonsense, let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't loud, but it echoed in that silent room like a thunderclap. She pressed her lips together, clearly trying to compose herself, but her eyes sparkled with something that looked an awful lot like disbelief and vindication all at once. She looked up at my father, then back down at the letter, shaking her head slowly. And when she finally spoke, her voice was laced with the kind of incredulity that only comes from witnessing something truly absurd. "Mr. Brennan," she said, "we need to talk. You're about to hear the full story of how I brought my father's lies crashing down in front of a judge, a courtroom full of witnesses, and the family that had spent decades pretending not to see what was right in front of them. And trust me, the part where the truth finally comes out is not even the most satisfying moment. My name is Rachel Brennan. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that keeping quiet was the same thing as keeping peace. I grew up in Riverside, a small town in Ohio where everyone knows everyone, where reputations are currency, and where my father, Thomas Brennan, was a man people respected. He owned Brennan and Sons Hardware Supply, a business his father had started in the 60s. It wasn't a fortune, but it was steady, reliable, and it made him a fixture in the community. People tipped their hats to him at the grocery store. They shook his hand at church. They called him Tom, good old dependable Tom. But at home, behind the walls of the house on Maple Street, Tom Brennan was a different man entirely. He was controlling, cold, and quick to remind you that everything you had came from him. He never hit us, not in the way that leaves visible marks, but he wielded words like weapons. He knew exactly how to make you feel small, worthless, like you owed him your very existence. And my mother, Linda, God rest her soul, she never stood up to him. Not once. I was the oldest of 3. There was me, then my brother Marcus, and finally Nicole, who came along 6 years after I did. Marcus was always Dad's favorite, the son who would carry on the family name and the family business. He could do no wrong in Dad's eyes, even when he was doing everything wrong. He dropped out of college twice, racked up DUIs, borrowed money he never paid back, and still, Dad made excuses for him. Boys will be boys, he'd say. He's just finding his way. I, on the other hand, was the responsible one. I kept my grades up, worked part-time at the hardware store without being asked, helped Mom with the housework, and made sure Nicole had someone looking out for her. I learned early on that love in our house wasn't given freely. It was earned through usefulness, through silence, through never making waves. So that's what I did. I stayed quiet. I stayed useful. And I told myself that was enough. Nicole was different from both Marcus and me. She was born with a developmental condition that made learning harder for her, socializing more challenging, and left her dependent on support for most of her daily routines. She wasn't incapable, far from it, but she needed structure, patience, and people who actually cared about her well-being. Mom had been that person. She took Nicole to her therapy appointments, helped her with schoolwork, celebrated every small victory like it was a miracle. And it was, in a way. Nicole graduating high school was one of the proudest days of Mom's life. Dad, though, saw Nicole as an inconvenience. He didn't say it outright, not in those exact words, but you could see it in the way he sighed when she asked questions, the way he'd leave the room when she needed help, the way he made it clear that Marcus was the child who mattered and Nicole was just someone to be managed. Mom shielded her from most of it, but I saw everything. I was the one who stayed up late helping Nicole practice reading, who took her to the park when Dad said she was too much trouble to bring along, who held her when she cried because she knew, somewhere deep down, that he didn't see her the way he saw Marcus. When I turned 18, I left for college 2 hours away in Columbus. It wasn't far, but it felt like freedom. For the first time in my life, I could breathe without waiting for criticism, without feeling like I had to justify my existence. I studied accounting, worked my way through school, and built a life that was mine. I called home every week, came back for holidays, and sent money when things got tight. But I kept my distance emotionally. I had to. Staying too close to that house meant staying too close to the version of myself that I'd spent years trying to leave behind. Marcus never left. He lived in the apartment above the hardware store, worked sporadically for Dad, and continued to live his life like a teenager well into his 30s. And Dad loved him for it. Depended on him, even. It didn't matter that Marcus barely showed up on time or that half the town knew he drank too much. He was the son, and that was all that mattered. When I was 27, Mom got sick. Cancer, aggressive and unforgiving. She fought it for 2 years, and during that time, I came home every weekend. I sat with her during chemo, cooked meals she could barely eat, and listened as she talked about her regrets. One of the biggest, she told me in a moment of heartbreaking clarity, was that she'd never stood up to Dad. Not for herself, and not for us. "I should have protected you girls more," she whispered one night, her hand trembling in mine. I thought if I kept the peace, it would be enough. But it wasn't, was it? I didn't know what to say. So I just held her hand and told her it was okay, even though it wasn't. Mom passed away on a cold Tuesday morning in November. The funeral was small, tasteful, and Dad played the role of grieving widower with practiced ease. People hugged him, told him how sorry they were, praised him for being so strong. I stood off to the side with Nicole, who sobbed into my shoulder, and watched him accept their sympathy like it was his due. After the funeral, things shifted. Dad remarried within a year to a woman named Diane, someone he'd known from church. She was polite, reserved, and clearly had no interest in being a mother figure to anyone. That was fine by me. What wasn't fine was what started happening to Nicole. With Mom gone, there was no buffer anymore. Nicole was living at home, attending a local day program for adults with developmental disabilities, and relying on Dad for housing and basic support. But Dad had checked out completely. He stopped taking her to appointments. He stopped making sure she had what she needed. He complained constantly about the cost of her care, about how she was a burden, about how he'd done his part and now it was someone else's turn. I tried to help from Columbus. I sent money for her expenses. I called her every other day to check in. I drove down on weekends when I could. But I couldn't be there all the time, and Nicole was suffering because of it. She started losing weight. She seemed anxious, withdrawn. When I asked her what was wrong, she'd just shake her head and say she didn't want to cause trouble. It all came to a head about 6 months ago. I got a call from Nicole's case manager, a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who told me she was concerned. Nicole had missed several appointments, and when Mrs. Pruitt went to the house to check on her, Dad had been dismissive and hostile. He'd told her Nicole was fine and that she needed to mind her own business. That's when I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just send money and hope for the best anymore. So I started looking into options. I researched guardianship laws, talked to lawyers, and pieced together what it would take to get Nicole out of that house and into a safe, stable environment. The problem was, legally, Dad was still her guardian. And he wasn't going to give that up without a fight. I filed a petition with Riverside County Family Court to transfer guardianship of Nicole from Dad to me. I knew it would be ugly. I knew Dad would fight it, not because he cared about Nicole, but because losing guardianship would be an admission that he'd failed. And Thomas Brennan did not admit failure. The court date was set for early December. I hired a lawyer, a sharp woman named Angela Reeves who specialized in family law and had a reputation for not backing down. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I gathered evidence, medical records, financial documents, testimony from Nicole's care team, anything that would show the court that Dad was neglecting her and that she deserved better. But I also knew that evidence alone might not be enough. Dad was charming when he needed to be. He knew how to play the victim, how to twist things so that he came out looking like the one who'd been wronged. He'd done it my entire life, and he was good at it. So I started writing a letter. Not a legal document, not a formal statement, but a letter. 5 pages of truth, the kind of truth that doesn't fit neatly into court filings or lawyer arguments. I wrote about what it was like growing up in that house, about the way he treated Nicole, about the lies he'd told and the image he'd carefully constructed. I wrote about the money I'd sent over the years, about the appointments he'd missed, about the nights Nicole had called me crying because she felt invisible in her own home. I didn't know if the judge would even read it. But I knew I had to try. Because Nicole deserved someone to stand up for her, and if no one else was going to do it, then it had to be me. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I drove down from Columbus the night before and stayed in a motel near the courthouse. I barely slept. I went over everything in my mind, played out scenarios, imagined what Dad would say, what his lawyer would argue, how the judge would react. I thought about Nicole, about the little girl who used to follow me around the house, who used to ask me to read her the same story every single night, who trusted me in a way she'd never been able to trust anyone else. I couldn't let her down. Not this time. When I walked into the Riverside County Courthouse that morning, the air was cold and sterile, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there. The building smelled like old wood and floor wax, and my footsteps echoed as I made my way to the second floor where family court was held. Angela was already there, standing outside the courtroom with a briefcase in one hand and a coffee in the other. She gave me a tight smile. "You ready?" she asked. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure I was. Inside the courtroom, Dad was already seated at the defense table with his lawyer, Gregory Sutton, a man in an expensive suit who looked like he spent more time on the golf course than in a courtroom. Dad was dressed sharply too, playing the part of the respectable businessman and concerned father. When he saw me, his expression didn't change. He just stared, cold and unreadable. Nicole was sitting in the front row with her case manager. She looked terrified. I wanted to go to her, to tell her everything was going to be okay, but I couldn't. Not yet. Judge Patricia Hartwell entered, and we all stood. She was in her late 50s, gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. She had a reputation in Riverside County for being fair but tough, the kind of judge who didn't tolerate games or manipulation. I hoped that reputation was earned. The hearing began with opening statements. Angela laid out our case clearly and methodically. She presented the facts, Nicole's missed appointments, the lack of proper care, the financial neglect, the emotional toll. She called Mrs. Pruitt to the stand, who testified about her concerns and the resistance she'd faced from Dad. She called Nicole's doctor, who confirmed that Nicole's health had declined in the months since Mom's death. Then it was Mr. Sutton's turn. He painted a picture of a devoted father who'd done everything he could under difficult circumstances. He talked about how hard it had been to lose his wife, how he was doing his best to care for a daughter with special needs, how Rachel, that's me, had swooped in with accusations and judgment without understanding the full picture. He made it sound like I was the villain, the meddling older sister with a savior complex. I sat there, hands clenched in my lap, biting my tongue. Then Dad took the stand. And that's when the mask started to slip. Mr. Sutton asked him about Nicole's care. Dad talked about all the things he'd supposedly done, the sacrifices he'd made, how much he loved his daughter. But when Angela cross-examined him, cracks started to form. She asked about specific appointments. He couldn't remember them. She asked about medications. He didn't know the names. She asked about the money I'd been sending. He claimed he didn't need it, that I'd sent it without being asked, which was a lie. Then Angela asked about the day program Nicole attended. When was the last time you visited her there, Mr. Brennan? He hesitated. I don't recall exactly. Was it within the last 6 months? Another pause. I've been busy with the business. So you haven't visited at all? His jaw tightened. That's not fair. I provide for her. She has a roof over her head. And that's when he made the mistake. Angela asked him about Mom, about the role she'd played in Nicole's care. And Dad, clearly frustrated, snapped. Linda did all that stuff because she wanted to. I had a business to run. I couldn't be expected to do everything. The courtroom went quiet. Even Mr. Sutton looked uncomfortable. Angela pressed further. So you relied entirely on your late wife to care for Nicole? She was better at it than I was. Women usually are. I saw Judge Hartwell's eyebrow twitch. And now that your wife is gone, who do you rely on? I manage just fine. Do you? Because the records show that Nicole has missed 12 medical appointments in the last 8 months. Her weight has dropped 15 pounds. Her day program supervisor reported that she frequently arrives without lunch or proper supplies. Does that sound like managing just fine to you, Mr. Brennan? Dad's face turned red. He opened his mouth, then closed it. And then, in a moment that I will never forget, he turned and looked directly at Nicole, who was sitting quietly in the front row, and he shouted. You ungrateful little liar. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? That's when I stood up. That's when I walked down the aisle. That's when I handed the judge my letter. And that's when everything changed. Judge Hartwell's eyes moved across the pages with deliberate slowness. The courtroom remained frozen in that strange suspended state where everyone knows something significant is happening but no one dares to breathe too loudly. My father had gone pale, his earlier bluster evaporating as he watched the judge read. Mr. Sutton leaned over and whispered something to him, but Dad didn't respond. He just stared at the letter in the judge's hands like it was a live grenade. I returned to my seat, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Angela reached over and squeezed my hand briefly, a small gesture of solidarity that nearly broke my composure. Nicole was looking at me with wide, confused eyes, and I gave her the smallest nod, hoping it conveyed something reassuring. Judge Hartwell turned to the second page, then the third. Her expression shifted subtly, a tightening around her mouth, a narrowing of her eyes. When she reached the fourth page, I saw her pause on a particular section. I knew which part she was reading because I'd written and rewritten that paragraph a dozen times. It was about the day of Mom's funeral, about how Dad had stood at the reception accepting condolences while Nicole sat alone in a corner, forgotten, and how I'd found her there crying because no one had brought her any food and she didn't know if she was allowed to get up. The judge looked up then, not at my father, but at Nicole. Her gaze softened for just a moment before hardening again as she returned to the letter. She read the final page, then carefully placed the document down on the bench in front of her. She removed her glasses, cleaned them with a small cloth from her robe pocket, and put them back on. The silence stretched so long that someone in the back of the courtroom coughed, and it sounded like a gunshot. Then Judge Hartwell did something I didn't expect. She smiled. Not a warm smile, not a friendly smile, but the kind of smile someone wears when they've just watched someone dig their own grave and then hand over the shovel. It was that smile, combined with the short laugh she'd let slip earlier, that told me she'd seen through every carefully constructed lie my father had spent decades building. She picked up the letter again and held it up slightly. "Mr. Brennan," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made everyone sit up straighter. "This letter contains some rather interesting information. Information that, frankly, calls into question everything your counsel has presented today." Mr. Sutton stood up quickly. "Your Honor, I object. We haven't had a chance to review this document. It's highly irregular for the court to accept evidence that hasn't been properly submitted through discovery." Judge Hartwell turned her gaze to him, and I watched him actually take a half step back. "Mr. Sutton, this is a family court hearing, not a criminal trial. I have wide discretion in what I choose to consider, particularly when it comes to the welfare of a vulnerable adult. And this letter," she tapped it with one finger, "contains factual claims that can be verified. In fact, several of them already have been verified by testimony we heard earlier today." She turned back to my father. "Mr. Brennan, according to this letter, your daughter Rachel has sent you a total of $18,000 over the past 3 years, specifically designated for Nicole's care expenses. Medical copays, therapy sessions, adaptive equipment, clothing, and personal needs. Is that accurate?" Dad shifted in his seat. His lawyer started to say something, but Dad cut him off. "I received money from Rachel, yes. But it wasn't that much, and it wasn't specifically for Nicole. It was to help with general household expenses." Judge Hartwell glanced down at the letter. "The letter includes copies of bank transfers with memo lines. Every single one specifies the purpose. Would you like me to read them aloud?" "That's not necessary," Mr. Sutton interjected quickly. "I think it is," the judge replied coolly. She flipped to a page that I knew contained the documentation I'd painstakingly compiled. "March 15th, 2 years ago. $500. Memo, Nicole's dental work. June 3rd, same year. $300. Memo, summer day camp enrollment. September 22nd. $400. Memo, new winter clothing and shoes." "Should I continue, Mr. Brennan?" My father said nothing. His hands were gripping the edge of the table, knuckles white. "The letter also indicates," Judge Hartwell continued, "that you have repeatedly told family members and community members that caring for Nicole has been financially devastating, that you've had to dip into retirement savings, that the burden has been nearly unbearable. Yet your daughter has been subsidizing a significant portion of Nicole's care without any acknowledgement of that fact. Would you care to explain that discrepancy?" "I was doing my best," Dad said, and his voice had taken on a tone I knew well. It was the tone of a man who believed that if he just sounded sincere enough, people would believe him. Raising a child with special needs is expensive. Even with Rachel's help, which I appreciated, it was still a struggle. Judge Hartwell set the letter down and leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Brennan, I've been doing this job for 17 years. I've seen a lot of parents come through this courtroom. Some of them are genuinely overwhelmed and doing their best under impossible circumstances. Some of them are struggling with their own issues but trying to put their children first. And some of them," she paused, "are more concerned with how they appear than with the actual well-being of the people in their care." The words hung in the air like an indictment. She continued. "This letter also details several incidents where Nicole's basic needs were not met. Missed doctor's appointments that resulted in a medication lapse. A period of 3 weeks where she was not attending her day program because you, her father, simply didn't feel like driving her. An occasion where she went to school without a coat in January because, and I'm quoting here, you told her she'd lost the privilege of having a new one after she spilled juice on her shirt. Is that accurate?" "Those are exaggerations," Dad said, but his voice had lost its conviction. "Rachel has always been dramatic. She doesn't understand what it's like to deal with this every single day." Judge Hartwell picked up another document from her desk. This is a report from Nicole's day program supervisor, filed independently of this hearing 3 months ago. It corroborates several of the incidents mentioned in the letter. It also notes that Nicole has frequently arrived hungry, inadequately dressed for the weather, and on one occasion had not bathed in several days. The supervisor attempted to contact you multiple times, Mr. Brennan. You did not return her calls. I was busy, he said weakly. Too busy to return a call about your daughter's welfare? Judge Hartwell's voice had taken on an edge that could cut glass. Mr. Brennan, let me be very clear about something. This court's primary concern is Nicole's safety and well-being. Not your reputation. Not your convenience. Not your feelings. Hers. She turned to Angela. Ms. Reeves, does your client wish to add anything at this time? Angela stood. Your Honor, I believe the letter speaks for itself. My client, Rachel Brennan, is not here to attack her father. She's here because she loves her sister and because she has watched, for years, as Nicole's needs have been minimized and neglected. Rachel has the means, the willingness, and most importantly, the commitment to provide Nicole with a stable, loving home. She has already secured a larger apartment in Columbus with accommodations for Nicole's needs. She has enrolled Nicole in a highly rated day program near her workplace. She has met with medical professionals and therapists to ensure continuity of care. She is not asking this court to strip Mr. Brennan of his dignity. She is simply asking for the opportunity to give Nicole the life she deserves. Judge Hartwell nodded slowly. She looked at Nicole, who was still sitting in the front row, hands clasped in her lap. Nicole, would you like to say anything? Nicole looked terrified. She glanced at Dad, then at me, then back at the judge. Her voice, when it came out, was so quiet that the judge had to ask her to repeat herself. I want to live with Rachel, Nicole said, and then, as if the dam had broken, the words came faster. I want to live with Rachel because she's nice to me. She doesn't yell at me when I make mistakes. She helps me when I don't understand things. She makes me feel like I'm not stupid. You're not stupid, Nicole, Judge Hartwell said gently. You are absolutely not stupid. Dad made a scoffing sound, barely audible, but I heard it. So did the judge. Her eyes snapped to him with such intensity that he actually flinched. Mr. Brennan, she said, her voice dropping to a tone that was somehow both quiet and devastating, I have heard enough. This court finds that you are not currently capable of meeting Nicole's needs in a manner consistent with her dignity and welfare. I am granting temporary guardianship to Rachel Brennan, effective immediately. We will reconvene in 6 months for a review hearing, at which time we will determine whether this arrangement should become permanent. My father shot to his feet. You can't do this. She's my daughter. I have rights. You do have rights, Mr. Brennan, Judge Hartwell replied, unmoved by his outburst. And you've had years to exercise those rights responsibly. You chose not to. This court is not punishing you. This court is protecting Nicole. There's a difference, though I suspect you don't see it. She turned back to Angela. Ms. Reeves, I'll need a transition plan filed within 48 hours. Nicole will remain in your client's care starting today. Mr. Brennan, you will have supervised visitation rights if Nicole chooses to exercise them, but you will not have decision-making authority regarding her medical care, education, or living situation until this court determines otherwise. She banged her gavel once, a sound that seemed to echo in my chest. This hearing is adjourned. People began to stand, to gather their things, to murmur among themselves. I sat frozen for a moment, unable to fully process what had just happened. Angela was smiling, actually smiling, something I'd rarely seen her do. She turned to me and said simply, "You did it." But I wasn't thinking about victory. I was thinking about Nicole. I stood up and walked over to her, ignoring the fact that Dad was still standing at his table, glaring at me with such hatred that it should have burned. Nicole looked up at me with tear-filled eyes, and I pulled her into a hug. "You're coming home with me," I whispered. "You're safe now." She held on to me like she was afraid I might disappear, and I felt her shoulders shake with silent sobs. Mrs. Pruitt, her case manager, stood nearby with a tissue, dabbing at her own eyes. She nodded at me with something that looked like relief and gratitude. Behind us, I heard my father's voice, low and venomous. "You'll regret this, Rachel. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've just done." I turned to face him, still holding Nicole. For the first time in my life, I looked at Thomas Brennan without fear, without the desperate need for his approval, without the weight of decades of conditioning telling me to be quiet and compliant. "I already know exactly what I've done," I said calmly. "I protected my sister. Something you should have been doing all along." His face turned a mottled shade of red. Mr. Sutton put a hand on his arm, trying to steer him toward the exit, but Dad shook him off. He pointed at me, his hand trembling with rage. "You turned this court against me. You made me look like a monster." "I didn't make you look like anything," I replied. "I just told the truth. If you don't like how that reflects on you, maybe you should think about why the truth is so damaging." He opened his mouth to respond, but Judge Hartwell's voice cut through the room. "Mr. Brennan, I suggest you leave this courtroom before I hold you in contempt. The bailiff is standing right there, and I assure you, I have no patience left today." Dad glared at the judge, at me, at Nicole, then finally turned and stormed out. Mr. Sutton followed, briefcase in hand, looking like a man who just lost a case he thought was a sure thing. The door slammed behind them, and the tension in the room dropped by half. Judge Hartwell was gathering her papers, but she paused and looked directly at me. "Ms. Brennan," she said, and I turned to face her. "That letter you wrote, it was one of the most thorough, well-documented pieces of personal testimony I've seen in this courtroom. You didn't just tell me what happened. You showed me dates, details, corroboration. That made all the difference." "Thank you, Your Honor," I managed to say. She nodded once. "Take care of your sister. She's lucky to have you." And then she was gone, exiting through the door behind the bench, leaving Angela, Mrs. Pruitt, Nicole, and me standing in the empty courtroom. Angela started packing up her files. "I'll get the transition paperwork started today. You'll need to coordinate with Mrs. Pruitt on the logistics of moving Nicole's things. Do you have a plan for the next few days?" "I do," I said. I'd already taken a week off work. My apartment was ready. I'd bought groceries, set up the guest room with furniture Nicole would find comforting, and mapped out the route to her new day program. I'd been planning this for months, hoping it would happen but not daring to believe it actually would. Mrs. Pruitt handed me a folder. "These are Nicole's current care documents. Medications, therapy schedules, emergency contacts. I'll check in with you both next week, but if you need anything before then, call me anytime." I took the folder, feeling the weight of responsibility settle onto my shoulders. But it wasn't a burden. It was a purpose. It was the thing I'd been working toward without fully realizing it, maybe for my entire life. Nicole tugged on my sleeve. "Can we go now?" "Yeah," I said, squeezing her hand. "Let's go home." We walked out of the courthouse together, into the cold December air. The sky was overcast, threatening snow, and the wind cut through my coat. But I barely felt it. Nicole stayed close to me, her hand gripping mine tightly, and I realized that for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt like I'd done something that actually mattered. The drive back to Maple Street to collect Nicole's belongings was tense. I knew Dad would be there, and I knew it wasn't going to be pleasant. I'd called ahead and arranged for Mrs. Pruitt to meet us there, both as a witness and as a buffer. Angela had advised me to bring a police officer if I felt unsafe, but I didn't think it would come to that. Dad was many things, but he wasn't physically violent. His weapons were words, silence, and control. When we pulled up to the house, Dad's truck was in the driveway. Diane's car was gone, which wasn't surprising. She had a talent for disappearing whenever conflict arose. Mrs. Pruitt was already waiting on the sidewalk, her county vehicle parked on the street. She gave me a nod as Nicole and I approached. "Let's make this quick," Mrs. Pruitt said quietly. Get what she needs, and we'll go. I opened the front door with the key I still had from years ago, one that I'd never bothered to return because some part of me always knew I might need it. The house smelled the same as it always had, a mix of old wood, coffee, and something faintly metallic that I'd never been able to identify. The living room was neat, almost sterile, the kind of clean that happened when no one actually lived in a space, they just existed in it. Dad was sitting in his recliner, the same one he'd sat in for as long as I could remember. He didn't look up when we entered. He just stared at the television, which wasn't even on, his jaw set in that stubborn line that meant he was furious but determined not to show it. "We're here to get Nicole's things," I said, keeping my voice even. "We'll be out of your way as soon as possible." He didn't respond. Nicole hesitated in the doorway, looking between me and Dad like she was waiting for permission. I put my hand on her shoulder. "Go ahead, sweetheart. Pack whatever you want to bring. Your clothes, your books, anything that's important to you." She nodded and disappeared down the hallway toward her room. Mrs. Pruitt followed her, leaving me alone with Dad. The silence stretched. I stood there, waiting, knowing he'd crack eventually. He always did when he wanted to get the last word. Finally, he spoke, still not looking at me. "You've ruined this family." "I've protected Nicole," I corrected. "There's a difference." He turned his head then, his eyes cold. "You made me look like a fool in front of that judge. In front of the whole town. People are going to talk." "Let them talk," I said. "Maybe they'll finally see what I've been seeing for 30 years. You always thought you were better than the rest of us," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. High and mighty Rachel, off in the city with her fancy job, looking down on the people who raised her. "I didn't look down on anyone," I said quietly. "I just refused to keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. Your mother would be ashamed of you." That hit harder than I expected, and I felt my chest tighten. But I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm. "No," I said. "Mom would be proud. She spent her whole life wishing she'd been brave enough to stand up to you. She told me that herself, right before she died." His face darkened. "You're a liar." "I'm not," I said. "And deep down, you know it. You know that Mom carried this family while you took credit for it. You know that Marcus has been coasting on your favoritism his whole life and has nothing to show for it. And you know that Nicole deserved better than what you gave her." He stood up abruptly, and for a moment, I thought he might actually try to intimidate me physically. But he just stood there, fists clenched at his sides, trembling with suppressed rage. "Get out of my house." "We're leaving," I said. "As soon as Nicole is ready. And don't come back. You're not welcome here anymore. Not for holidays, not for birthdays, not ever. As far as I'm concerned, you're not my daughter." I'd expected those words. I'd prepared for them. But hearing them still hurt in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. Not because I wanted his approval anymore, but because it was the final confirmation that he'd never actually loved me. I'd been useful, and then I'd stopped being useful, and now I was discarded. "Okay," I said simply. He blinked, clearly thrown by my lack of reaction. "That's it? Just okay? What do you want me to say, Dad? That I'll beg you to reconsider? That I'll apologize for protecting Nicole? I'm not going to do that. You've made your choice, and I've made mine." Nicole appeared in the hallway then, dragging a suitcase that looked too heavy for her. Mrs. Pruitt was behind her, carrying a box of books and personal items. I moved to help Nicole with the suitcase, and together we carried everything out to my car. Dad didn't follow us. He didn't say goodbye to Nicole. He just stood in the living room, a man who'd spent his whole life building an image and had just watched it crumble. We loaded everything into the trunk, and Nicole climbed into the passenger seat. Mrs. Pruitt gave me her card again, reminded me to call if I needed anything, and drove off. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the house I'd grown up in. It looked smaller than I remembered. Less significant. "Are you okay?" Nicole asked quietly. I turned to her and smiled. Yeah, I'm okay. Are you? She nodded. I'm happy. I get to live with you now. Yeah, I said, starting the car. You do. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Dad standing in the doorway, watching us leave. Part of me wondered if he'd eventually realize what he'd lost. But most of me didn't care anymore. I'd spent enough of my life trying to earn his love. Now I was going to spend the rest of it giving that love to someone who actually deserved it. The drive back to Columbus was quiet but not uncomfortable. Nicole dozed off about halfway through, her head resting against the window, and I let myself think about everything that had happened. The hearing, the letter, the judge's reaction, Dad's final words. It all felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. But it was real. And it was over. Or at least, this chapter of it was. There would be more hearings, more paperwork, more adjustments as Nicole settled into her new life. But the hardest part, the standing up and refusing to be silent anymore, that was done. When we got back to my apartment, Nicole woke up and looked around with wide, curious eyes. This is where you live? Yeah, I said. And now it's where you live too. She smiled, a real genuine smile that I hadn't seen from her in months. Can I see my room? I led her down the hallway and opened the door to the guest room, which I'd spent weeks preparing. The walls were painted a soft lavender, her favorite color. There was a comfortable bed with a thick quilt, a bookshelf already filled with books I thought she'd like, and a desk by the window with art supplies. I'd even hung up some of her drawings that I'd saved from years ago, the ones Mom used to put on the fridge. Nicole walked in slowly, touching everything like she couldn't quite believe it was real. This is mine. All yours, I said. She turned to me, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much. I pulled her into a hug and held her while she cried, this time not from fear or sadness, but from relief. And I realized that this, right here, was what winning actually looked like. Not a judge's ruling or a clever letter or even the look on Dad's face when he realized he'd lost. It was this moment, knowing that Nicole was safe, that she felt loved, that she finally had a place where she belonged. That night, after Nicole had fallen asleep in her new room, I sat on my couch with a cup of tea and reread the letter I'd written for the judge. 5 pages of truth, years of pain distilled into words that had changed everything. Angela had asked if she could keep a copy for her files, said it was one of the most effective pieces of evidence she'd ever presented. But I didn't write it to be effective. I wrote it because silence had stopped being an option. I wrote it because Nicole deserved someone to speak up. And I wrote it because I was done carrying the weight of a family's dysfunction on my shoulders while pretending everything was fine. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Kelly, my friend from college who I'd confided in throughout this whole process. She'd been checking in regularly, offering support, reminding me that I was doing the right thing even when I doubted myself. How did it go? She'd written. I typed back, we won. Nicole's home. Her response came immediately. I'm so proud of you. You want company tomorrow? I can bring wine and terrible movies. I smiled. That sounds perfect. I set the phone down and looked around my apartment. It wasn't big, and it wasn't fancy, but it was filled with the kind of peace that only comes when you finally stop living for other people's approval and start living for what actually matters. Tomorrow I'd start figuring out the logistics, the new routines, the adjustments we'd both need to make. But tonight, I let myself just sit in the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd done something that couldn't be undone. Nicole was safe. The truth had been told. And for the first time in my life, I'd chosen myself and someone I loved over the comfort of staying silent. The judge had laughed because my father's lies were so transparent, so absurd in the face of documented evidence, that they'd become almost farcical. But that laugh wasn't just about him. It was about every person who'd ever tried to rewrite reality to suit their narrative, who'd tried to claim victimhood while inflicting harm, who'd counted on everyone else staying quiet. Judge Hartwell had seen through it. The court had seen through it. And now, everyone else would too. I finished my tea, turned off the lights, and checked on Nicole one more time before going to bed. She was sleeping soundly, her face peaceful in a way I hadn't seen since before Mom died. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her breathe, and felt something settle deep in my chest. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Not obligation, not performance, not walking on eggshells to keep the peace. Just safety, love, and the knowledge that you weren't alone. I closed her door gently and went to my own room, where I slept better than I had in years. The first week with Nicole was a dance of adjustment and discovery. I'd imagined it would be difficult, that there would be tears and resistance and moments where she'd want to go back to what was familiar, even if what was familiar had been harmful. But Nicole surprised me. She adapted with a resilience I hadn't expected, like a plant that had been kept in the dark suddenly finding sunlight. She woke up early that first morning, disoriented and anxious until she remembered where she was. I heard her moving around in her room and knocked gently on the door. When she opened it, her hair was messy and her eyes were still puffy from sleep, but she smiled at me. "Did you sleep okay?" I asked. "Better than I have in a long time," she said, and the honesty in her voice made my throat tight. We made breakfast together, something simple, scrambled eggs and toast, and she sat at my kitchen table like she'd been doing it her whole life. She asked if she could help with things, if there were rules she needed to know, if she was allowed to use the television. Each question broke my heart a little more because they revealed just how controlled her life had been, how she'd learned to ask permission for the smallest comforts. "You live here now," I told her gently. "You don't need permission to watch TV or get a snack or take a shower. This is your home too." She nodded, but I could see it would take time for her to truly believe it. That afternoon, I took her to meet Dr. Patel, the therapist I'd lined up specifically for adults with developmental disabilities. Dr. Patel was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an easy manner that put Nicole at ease almost immediately. She spent an hour talking with Nicole while I sat in the waiting room, filling out paperwork and trying not to think about all the therapy appointments Dad had skipped or canceled over the years. When they emerged, Dr. Patel pulled me aside. "She's been through a lot," she said quietly. "There's some trauma there that we'll need to work through, but she's motivated and she trusts you. That's a strong foundation." Over the next few days, I introduced Nicole to her new routine. We visited the day program where she'd be spending her weekdays, a bright facility called Horizons Community Center that offered vocational training, social activities, and life skills classes. The director, an energetic woman named Ms. Chin, gave us a tour and introduced Nicole to some of the other participants. I watched Nicole light up as she talked to a girl around her age who was showing her a painting she'd made, and I felt something loosen in my chest. "This is where I'll come every day?" Nicole asked as we drove home. "Every weekday," I confirmed. "And if you like it, you can join some of their evening activities too. They have art classes and movie nights." "I think I'll like it," she said, and the certainty in her voice was new, fragile but growing. By the end of that first week, we'd established a rhythm. I'd wake up early, make breakfast, and help Nicole get ready for the day program. A transport van picked her up at 8, and I'd head to my office at the accounting firm. I'd arranged with my boss to work slightly modified hours so I could be home when Nicole returned at 4. We'd have dinner together, watch a show, or just talk. Simple things, ordinary things, but they felt monumental after years of watching her exist in a house where she was treated as an afterthought. But not everything was smooth. There were moments when Nicole would freeze up, when something would trigger a memory or a fear and she'd retreat into herself. One evening, I accidentally raised my voice in frustration when I couldn't find my car keys, and Nicole immediately went silent, her shoulders hunching, her eyes dropping to the floor. It took me a moment to realize what had happened, how a simple moment of irritation had sent her back to a place where raised voices meant danger. "I'm sorry," I said, kneeling down so I was at her eye level. "I'm not angry at you. I'm just frustrated with myself. You didn't do anything wrong." It took her several minutes to relax, to believe that I wasn't going to yell at her or punish her or withdraw affection. Each incident like that was a reminder of how much damage had been done, how long it would take to undo patterns that had been ingrained over years. Meanwhile, the outside world was catching up to what had happened in that courtroom. Riverside was a small town, and news traveled fast. Within days of the hearing, it seemed like everyone knew that Thomas Brennan had lost guardianship of his daughter, that his older daughter had exposed him in court, that there had been some kind of letter that had changed everything. I started getting messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Some were supportive, distant relatives and old family friends who said they'd always suspected something wasn't right. Others were defensive, people who couldn't reconcile the Tom Brennan they knew from church or the hardware store with the man who'd been called out in family court. A few were outright hostile, accusing me of airing private family matters in public, of betraying my father, of being vindictive and cruel. I didn't respond to most of them. What was there to say? The people who mattered, the ones who'd seen Nicole's decline and done nothing, didn't deserve an explanation. And the people who genuinely cared had already reached out privately, offering help and support rather than judgment. Kelly came over that weekend like she'd promised, armed with wine and a stack of deliberately bad romantic comedies. Nicole was shy around her at first, but Kelly had a gift for making people feel comfortable. By the end of the evening, Nicole was laughing at Kelly's commentary on the movies, and I felt a wave of gratitude for having a friend who didn't need the whole story explained, who just showed up when it mattered. After Nicole went to bed, Kelly and I sat on the couch with our wine, the television on low volume. "How are you really doing?" she asked. "I'm tired," I admitted. "But it's a good tired, if that makes sense. Like I'm tired from building something instead of tired from holding something together." She nodded. "Your dad's a piece of work, you know that?" "I know. I've always known. I just spent a long time pretending I didn't." Kelly took a sip of her wine. "Have you heard from him at all?" "No. And I don't expect to. When he said I wasn't his daughter anymore, he meant it. That's who he is. If you're not useful to him or if you challenge him, you're cut off." "And your brother? Marcus?" I shook my head. Radio silence. "He's probably furious that I made Dad look bad. Marcus has always needed Dad's approval more than anyone." Kelly was quiet for a moment. "You know this is going to get messy before it gets better, right? People like your dad don't just accept losing. They retaliate." "I know," I said. "But what else can he do?" "The court ruled. Nicole's here. There's nothing left for him to take." I believed that when I said it. I really did. But I should have known better. I should have remembered that my father was a man who'd built his entire life on control, and when you take control away from someone like that, they don't just give up. They find other ways to hurt you. The first sign came 2 weeks later. I was at work, in the middle of a quarterly review meeting, when my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I normally wouldn't have answered, but something made me excuse myself and step into the hallway. The voice on the other end was professional, clipped. "Ms. Brennan? This is Officer Dwight from the Riverside Police Department. We need you to come down to the station to answer some questions regarding a complaint that's been filed." My stomach dropped. "A complaint? About what?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss details over the phone, but it concerns your sister, Nicole Brennan. Can you come in this afternoon?" I told him I'd be there within 2 hours, ended the call, and stood in the hallway trying to steady my breathing. A complaint? Filed by who? About what? My mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. I called Angela immediately. She answered on the second ring, and I explained the situation as calmly as I could. "Don't say anything without me there," she said firmly. "I'll meet you at the station. And Rachel, this is probably your father. He's trying to create problems because he lost in court." "Can he do that?" "He can file complaints. Whether they have merit is another question. Just stay calm and let me handle it." The drive to Riverside felt endless. I'd called the day program to check on Nicole, and Ms. Chen assured me she was fine, that she'd had a good morning and was currently in an art class. That eased some of my panic, but not all of it. Angela was waiting outside the police station when I arrived, briefcase in hand and expression all business. We went inside together, and Officer Dwight led us to a small interview room that smelled like stale coffee and cleaning solution. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with a professional demeanor that gave nothing away. "Ms. Brennan," he began, "we received a complaint from Thomas Brennan alleging that his daughter Nicole was removed from his home under false pretenses and that you have been preventing him from having contact with her." "That's not true," I said immediately, but Angela put a hand on my arm. "Officer," Angela interjected, "my client has full legal guardianship of Nicole Brennan as granted by Judge Hartwell in Riverside County Family Court 2 weeks ago. The ruling was based on substantial evidence of neglect and failure to meet Nicole's care needs. Mr. Brennan was granted supervised visitation rights if Nicole chooses to exercise them. He has made no attempt to schedule such visits through the proper channels." Officer Dwight consulted a file in front of him. "Mr. Brennan claims he's tried to call Nicole multiple times and that Ms. Brennan has blocked his number." "I changed Nicole's phone number," I said, keeping my voice level, "because he was calling her late at night and upsetting her. The court order doesn't require me to maintain his access to her personal phone. If he wants to see her, he can go through the proper legal channels for supervised visitation." "He also claims," Officer Dwight continued, "that you coerced Nicole into testifying against him in court and that the guardianship was obtained through manipulation." Angela's expression hardened. "Officer, that's a serious accusation with zero evidence. Nicole testified voluntarily, in the presence of a judge, her case manager, and legal counsel. If Mr. Brennan wishes to challenge the court's ruling, he can file an appeal. What he cannot do is harass my client through false police reports." Officer Dwight seemed to consider this. "Look, I'm just following up on a complaint. Based on what you're telling me and the documentation you can provide, it sounds like this is a civil matter, not a criminal one. But I have to document that we spoke." "I understand," Angela said. "And I'll be filing a report with the court about this attempt at harassment. If Mr. Brennan continues to misuse law enforcement resources, we'll be seeking a restraining order." We left the station 20 minutes later, and I felt shaky, angry, and unsettled all at once. Angela walked me to my car. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said. "He's going to try to make your life difficult in any way he can. Document everything. Every call, every message, every incident. If he escalates, we'll go back to court." I nodded, feeling the weight of it settle over me. I'd thought the hearing was the end. I hadn't realized it was just the beginning of a different kind of battle. That evening, I didn't tell Nicole about the police station. I didn't want to scare her or make her feel like she was the cause of problems. We had dinner, watched a nature documentary she'd picked out, and went through our evening routine like nothing had happened. But after she went to bed, I sat in my living room and let myself feel the anger I'd been holding back all day. My father was doing exactly what he'd always done. He was punishing me for standing up to him, for refusing to play the role he'd assigned me. He couldn't control Nicole anymore, so he was trying to control me, to make me regret my decision, to wear me down until I gave up. But he'd miscalculated. Because I wasn't the same person who'd spent her childhood swallowing hurt to keep the peace. I wasn't the same woman who'd driven home from college every weekend to help a mother who couldn't help herself. I'd spent years learning to be small, to be accommodating, to put everyone else's needs before my own. I was done with that. And no police complaint or late-night phone call was going to change my mind. The next incident came a week later. I was at the grocery store with Nicole, letting her pick out snacks for the week, when I ran into Mrs. Henderson, an older woman who'd gone to church with my parents for decades. She'd always been kind to me growing up, one of those warm, grandmotherly types who remembered everyone's birthdays. But when she saw me, her expression turned cold. She walked right up to me, ignoring Nicole entirely, and said in a voice loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear, "I cannot believe what you did to your father. That man raised you, and this is how you repay him. You should be ashamed." I felt Nicole tense beside me. People were starting to stare. "Mrs. Henderson," I said quietly, "you don't know the full story." "I know enough," she snapped. Tom Brennan is a good man, and you dragged his name through the mud in that courtroom. What kind of daughter does that? The kind who protects her sister, I replied, my voice steady despite the anger rising in my chest. If you'd like to have an actual conversation about what happened, I'm happy to explain. But I'm not going to stand here and be lectured based on half-truths and gossip. She drew herself up, affronted. Well, I never. No, I said, you probably haven't. You've probably never had to stand up to someone you're supposed to respect because they were hurting someone you love. But I did. And I'd do it again. She huffed, turned on her heel, and walked away. Nicole was staring at me with wide eyes. Are you okay? She asked. I'm fine, I said, putting a hand on her shoulder. Some people are going to believe what they want to believe, no matter what the truth is. That's not our problem. But I could see the worry in her face, the fear that she was causing trouble, that she was the reason people were angry. That night, I sat her down and tried to explain. Nicole, none of this is your fault. Do you understand that? People are upset because the truth came out, and the truth is uncomfortable for them. But you didn't do anything wrong. You never did anything wrong. Dad's mad at me, she said quietly. Dad's mad at me, I corrected. And he's going to stay mad because he can't admit that he was wrong. But that's his problem, not yours. You're safe here. You're loved here. And nothing he says or does is going to change that. She nodded, but I could tell she was still processing it, still learning to believe that she wasn't responsible for other people's anger. The harassment continued sporadically over the next month. My father never contacted me directly, but his presence was felt. He spread stories around town, painting himself as the victim of an ungrateful daughter who'd stolen his child. He told people I'd lied in court, that I'd manipulated the judge, that I was mentally unstable and couldn't be trusted. Some people believed him. Others didn't. But the constant drip of negativity wore on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I found myself avoiding certain parts of town, taking different routes to avoid running into people who might confront me. I stopped going to the coffee shop I used to love because the owner had made a pointed comment about family loyalty. I unfollowed people on social media who posted vague messages about respecting your parents and the sanctity of family. But through it all, Nicole thrived. She was gaining weight, her anxiety was decreasing, and she was forming real friendships at the day program. Dr. Patel reported that Nicole was making excellent progress in therapy, that she was starting to recognize and process the ways she'd been mistreated. Ms. Chin said Nicole had become one of the most engaged participants at Horizons, that she was taking pride in her work and opening up socially. Every positive report, every smile, every moment of watching Nicole relax into herself was validation that I'd made the right choice. The cost was high, but it was worth it. Then, about 6 weeks after the hearing, I got a call from Marcus. I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken since before the court date, and I knew he'd sided with Dad. But curiosity got the better of me. Rachel, his voice was different than I remembered. Less cocky, more subdued. Marcus. There was a long pause. Can we talk? In person? I don't think that's a good idea. Please, he said. I need to tell you something. It's important. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at a diner halfway between Columbus and Riverside. I didn't tell Nicole where I was going, just said I had an errand to run. Kelly insisted on knowing the details in case something went wrong, and I texted her the location before I left. Marcus was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee he clearly hadn't touched. He looked terrible. Thinner, tired, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. When he saw me, he stood up awkwardly, like he wasn't sure if he should try to hug me or shake my hand. We settled for an uncomfortable nod. I sat across from him and waited. I wasn't going to make this easy. I've been a coward, he said finally. His voice was rough, like he'd been practicing this speech but was already losing his nerve. I should have said something a long time ago. I should have stood up for Nicole. For you. For Mom. But I didn't, and I'm sorry. I studied him, trying to determine if this was genuine or just another manipulation. Okay. Dad's falling apart, Marcus continued. The business is struggling because people are pulling their accounts. He lost a major supplier contract last week. And Diane left him 3 days ago. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure what he expected me to say. He blames you for all of it, Marcus said. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I finally read the letter you gave to the judge. How did you get that? He looked down at his coffee. Dad had a copy. I found it in his office. He'd been reading it over and over, highlighting parts, writing angry notes in the margins. I took it and I read the whole thing, Rachel. Every word. And you were right. About everything. The way he treated Nicole, the way he treated all of us, the way he turned us against each other so we wouldn't unite against him. I've spent my whole life trying to be what he wanted, and it never mattered. Nothing I did was ever enough because it was never about me. It was about control. His voice broke on that last word, and I saw real pain there, genuine realization. But I also saw years of damage that one conversation couldn't undo. I'm glad you're seeing it, I said carefully. But I can't fix this for you, Marcus. You have to decide what kind of person you want to be and what kind of relationship you want with the people in your life. I know, he said. And I'm not asking you to fix anything. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. And I wanted to say I'm sorry. For not protecting Nicole. For not standing up for you. For being Dad's puppet for so long that I forgot who I was. We sat in silence for a long moment. Part of me wanted to tell him it was okay, to offer forgiveness and reconciliation. But another part, the part that had been hurt too many times by false promises and half-hearted apologies, held back. If you want to be in Nicole's life, I said finally, you can be. But it has to be on her terms, and it has to be genuine. She's been through enough. She doesn't need another person who's going to let her down. I understand, he said. Can I see her sometime? Just to talk. I'll ask her, I said. If she wants to see you, I'll arrange it. But Marcus, if you hurt her or disappoint her, that's it. There won't be another chance. I know, he said. And thank you. For taking care of her. For doing what I should have done. I left the diner without ordering anything. The conversation had been draining, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it. Marcus's apology seemed sincere, but sincerity didn't erase decades of enabling and complicity. Time would tell if he actually meant what he said or if this was just another performance. When I got home, Nicole was drawing at the kitchen table, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration the way it always did when she was focused. She looked up when I came in. Where'd you go? I had to meet someone, I said. Actually, it was Marcus. He wanted to talk. Her expression shifted, guarded. What did he want? To apologize, I said. He said he's sorry for not standing up for you, and he asked if he could see you sometime. She went quiet, her marker hovering over the paper. Do you think he means it? I don't know, I said honestly. But if you want to see him, we can arrange that. And if you don't, that's okay too. It's completely your choice. She thought about it for a long moment. Can I think about it? Of course. She went back to her drawing, but I could see her mind was elsewhere, processing, weighing, trying to decide if she could trust someone who'd let her down before. I recognized that internal struggle because I'd been through it myself more times than I could count. That night, after Nicole went to bed, I stood in my living room and looked around at the life I'd built. It wasn't perfect. There were still hard days, still moments where I questioned if I'd done the right thing, still echoes of my father's voice telling me I was selfish and ungrateful. But those echoes were getting quieter. And in their place was something I'd never really had before. Not approval, not validation from people who'd never cared about me, but something simpler and more profound. Peace. The kind that comes from knowing you've protected someone who needed protecting, that you've stood up when it mattered, that you've chosen love over comfort. I thought about Judge Hartwell's laugh, that brief, sharp sound that had cut through the courtroom. She'd laughed because the truth had been so obvious, so undeniable, that my father's attempts to spin it had become absurd. But she'd also laughed, I realized, because she'd seen this pattern before. She'd seen men like my father, people who built their entire identities on control and image, crumble when confronted with documented reality. The letter had been my truth. 5 pages that had taken 34 years to write. And it had changed everything. Not because it destroyed my father, though it had certainly damaged him. But because it freed me. It freed Nicole. And maybe, if Marcus was being honest, it might eventually free him too. The 6-month review hearing was coming up, and I knew I'd have to face my father in court again. But this time, I wasn't afraid. This time, I knew exactly who I was and what I was fighting for. And this time, I had proof that the decision had been the right one. Nicole was thriving. And that was the only evidence that mattered. The 6-month review hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in early June. I'd marked the date on my calendar the day Judge Hartwell had announced it, and I'd watched those months tick by with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Part of me believed the hearing would be a formality, that the evidence of Nicole's improvement would speak for itself. But another part, the part that had grown up learning that my father always found a way to twist things in his favor, remained wary. Angela had been preparing meticulously. She'd gathered progress reports from Dr. Patel, attendance records and evaluations from Horizons Community Center, updated medical records showing Nicole's improved health, and even testimonials from neighbors and friends who'd observed the change in Nicole's demeanor and well-being. We had photographs documenting Nicole's artwork, certificates from classes she'd completed, and a detailed log I'd kept of our daily routines and activities. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through every possible scenario. What if my father had found some loophole? What if he'd convinced people to testify on his behalf? What if the judge decided that 6 months wasn't enough time to make a permanent determination? Around 2 a.m, I heard Nicole's door open. She padded down the hallway and knocked softly on my door. "Rachel? Are you awake?" "Yeah, come in." She climbed onto the bed and sat cross-legged, her hair pulled back in the braid I'd helped her do before bed. "I can't sleep either." "Worried about tomorrow?" She nodded. "What if the judge makes me go back?" "That's not going to happen," I said, hoping my voice carried more certainty than I felt. "You're doing so well here. Everyone can see that. Dr. Patel, Ms. Chen, even your doctor. They've all documented how much happier and healthier you are. But what if Dad says things that make it seem like it's not true?" I sat up and took her hand. "Nicole, the judge isn't just going to listen to what people say. She's going to look at evidence. And the evidence is clear. You've gained 12 pounds since you moved in. You haven't missed a single therapy appointment or day program session. You're taking classes, making friends, doing things you never got to do before. That's what matters." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you think he's changed? Dad, I mean. Do you think he wishes he'd been nicer to me?" I chose my words carefully. I don't know what Dad wishes. But I know that whether or not he's changed doesn't affect whether you're safe and happy here. That's what the court cares about. Your well-being, not his feelings. She leaned against my shoulder. "I'm glad I live with you. I'm glad you live with me too." We sat like that for a while, and eventually her breathing evened out and she fell asleep. I carefully shifted so she could lie down properly, pulled a blanket over her, and spent the rest of the night watching her sleep, this person I'd promised to protect no matter what it cost me. Morning came too quickly. I made a breakfast neither of us had much appetite for, helped Nicole pick out an outfit that made her feel confident, and drove us both to Riverside. Angela had suggested we arrive early to go over any last-minute details, so we met her at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse. "How are you both feeling?" Angela asked, though the answer was probably obvious from our faces. "Nervous," I admitted. "But ready." "Good," she said. Because I've got some news. Your father's lawyer filed a motion yesterday afternoon. They're bringing witnesses. My stomach dropped. What kind of witnesses? People from the community. Former employees from the hardware store. Someone from their church. They're going to testify about your father's character, try to paint him as a devoted parent who made mistakes but deserves another chance. I felt Nicole's hand tighten around mine under the table. Can they do that? They can try, Angela said. But character witnesses are tricky. They can talk about what they observed, but they can't refute the documented evidence of neglect. And more importantly, we have our own witnesses. Mrs. Pruitt is testifying again. So is Ms. Chen from Horizons. And I've subpoenaed Nicole's pediatrician to provide expert testimony about her medical improvement. What about Nicole? I asked. Will she have to testify again? Only if the judge asks her directly. But I don't think it'll come to that. The progress reports speak for themselves. We finished our coffee and walked to the courthouse. The building looked exactly as it had 6 months ago, imposing and impersonal. But this time, I felt different walking through those doors. Less like a supplicant hoping for mercy and more like someone who knew she deserved to be heard. The courtroom was more crowded than I expected. My father was there, of course, seated at the same table with Mr. Sutton. He looked older than I remembered, more worn. Diane wasn't with him, which didn't surprise me given that Marcus had mentioned she'd left. But there were other faces I recognized scattered throughout the gallery. Mrs. Henderson from church. Bill Crawford, who'd worked at the hardware store for 20 years. A couple whose names I couldn't remember but whose faces were familiar from town events. They were his character witnesses, the people who'd come to vouch for the version of Thomas Brennan they'd been allowed to see. I wondered if any of them knew about the late-night phone calls he'd made to Nicole, trying to guilt her into asking to come home. I wondered if they knew about the police complaint he'd filed, or the stories he'd spread around town, or the way he'd told me I was no longer his daughter. Probably not. People like my father were experts at compartmentalization, at showing different faces to different audiences. The man these people knew was generous and hardworking and respected. They'd never seen the man who'd sighed with annoyance when his disabled daughter asked for help, or who'd missed her medical appointments because he couldn't be bothered, or who'd shouted at her in a courtroom that she was an ungrateful liar. Judge Hartwell entered, and we all stood. She looked the same as she had before, composed and unreadable. When we sat, she pulled out a thick file that I recognized as Nicole's case folder and began reviewing it silently. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the clock on the wall ticking. Finally, she looked up. We're here today for a 6-month review regarding the guardianship of Nicole Brennan. At the initial hearing, I granted temporary guardianship to Rachel Brennan with the provision that we would reconvene to assess Nicole's progress and determine whether this arrangement should become permanent. Mr. Sutton, I understand you have witnesses you'd like to present. Yes, Your Honor, Mr. Sutton stood. We'd like to call several individuals who can speak to Mr. Brennan's character and his commitment to his daughter's care. Judge Hartwell nodded. Proceed. Over the next hour, I sat and listened to people testify about what a good man my father was. Bill Crawford talked about how Dad had given him a job when he was down on his luck, how he'd always been fair and generous. Mrs. Henderson talked about his church involvement, his donations to the community center, his willingness to help neighbors in need. A younger woman I didn't recognize talked about how Dad had mentored her brother, had given him advice that had helped him turn his life around. None of them mentioned Nicole. None of them talked about visiting our home or observing how she was cared for. They talked about my father's public persona, the carefully maintained image of a good man doing his best. When it was Angela's turn to cross-examine, she was surgical in her precision. Mr. Crawford, you testified that you worked for Mr. Brennan for 20 years. In all that time, how many times did you meet his daughter Nicole? Bill Crawford shifted uncomfortably. Well, I saw her around sometimes. How many conversations did you have with her? I don't rightly recall having conversations with her, no. Did you ever visit the Brennan home? Not inside, no. Just drop things off at the door sometimes. So your testimony about Mr. Brennan's character as a father is based on what, exactly? Just, well, the way he talked about her. He seemed to care. Seemed to care, Angela repeated. Thank you, Mr. Crawford. She did the same with each witness, methodically revealing that none of them had first-hand knowledge of how Nicole was actually treated. They knew my father the businessman, the churchgoer, the community member. They didn't know my father the parent. Then it was our turn to present evidence. Mrs. Pruitt took the stand first and provided a detailed account of her visits to Nicole over the past 6 months. She described Nicole's transformation, the way she'd gone from withdrawn and anxious to engaged and confident. She presented attendance records showing perfect attendance at day program activities, participation logs showing Nicole's involvement in art classes, cooking workshops, and social events. Nicole has flourished, Mrs. Pruitt said simply. The difference between the young woman I met 6 months ago and the young woman I work with now is remarkable. She's happy. She's healthy. She's building a life. Ms. Chen from Horizons was even more effusive. She brought examples of Nicole's artwork, photographs of Nicole participating in group activities, and testimonials from other staff members. Nicole is one of our success stories, she said. She came to us hesitant and unsure of herself. Now she's helping mentor newer participants. She's developed leadership skills we didn't even know she had. Dr. Patel testified about Nicole's therapy progress, about the trauma responses she'd been working through, about the way Nicole had learned to recognize and articulate her needs. The most telling indicator, Dr. Patel said, is that Nicole now believes she deserves to be cared for. When I first met her, she apologized for everything. She assumed she was a burden. That belief system has completely shifted. She knows she has value. That's transformative. Finally, Dr. Morrison, Nicole's pediatrician, presented medical records. He showed charts documenting Nicole's weight gain, her improved sleep patterns, her reduced anxiety markers. From a purely medical standpoint, he said, Nicole's health has improved significantly under Ms. Brennan's guardianship. The markers we look for in terms of patient well-being are all moving in the right direction. When the testimony concluded, Judge Hartwell asked if Nicole wanted to say anything. Angela had prepared her for this possibility, had told her she could speak if she wanted to but didn't have to. Nicole stood up slowly, and I saw her hands trembling slightly. Your Honor, Nicole said, her voice soft but steady, I want to stay with Rachel. She makes me feel safe. She helps me when I need help, and she doesn't make me feel bad for needing it. I've learned so many things since I moved in with her. I'm taking art classes and I made friends and I don't feel scared all the time anymore. I know my dad is here and maybe he wants me back, but I don't want to go back. I want to stay where I'm happy. The courtroom was silent. Judge Hartwell's expression softened slightly. Thank you, Nicole. You can sit down. Nicole returned to her seat, and I put my arm around her shoulders. She was shaking, but she'd done it. She'd spoken up for herself. Judge Hartwell turned to my father. Mr. Brennan, do you wish to address the court? My father stood, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker across his face. Regret, maybe, or shame. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the familiar stubbornness. Your Honor, he began, his voice measured, I made mistakes. I won't deny that. Losing my wife was devastating, and I struggled to adapt to being Nicole's sole caregiver. But I love my daughter. I always have. And I believe I deserve the opportunity to prove that I can do better. Judge Hartwell regarded him steadily. Mr. Brennan, 6 months ago I granted your other daughter guardianship because the evidence clearly showed that Nicole's needs were not being met under your care. Today, I've heard testimony from multiple professionals that Nicole is thriving in her current placement. I've seen documented evidence of her medical, emotional, and social improvement. I've heard from Nicole herself that she feels safe and happy. She paused, and I held my breath. On the other hand, she continued, I've heard testimony from several people about your character in other contexts, but none of them could speak to your capacity as a caregiver for a young woman with Nicole's specific needs. You say you love your daughter. I don't doubt that you believe that. But love without action, without consistency, without putting someone else's needs before your own pride, is not enough. My father's jaw tightened. This court's responsibility is to Nicole, not to you, Judge Hartwell said. And based on everything I've seen and heard, it is clear that Nicole is exactly where she needs to be. Therefore, I am granting permanent guardianship of Nicole Brennan to Rachel Brennan, effective immediately. The gavel came down, and I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't even realized I'd been holding. Permanent. Not temporary, not provisional, not subject to review. Permanent. Nicole turned to me with tears streaming down her face. Does that mean I get to stay? Forever, I said, pulling her close. You get to stay forever. Behind us, I heard movement. My father was gathering his things, Mr. Sutton speaking to him in low tones. I didn't look back. I didn't need to see his reaction, didn't need to know if he was angry or hurt or indifferent. It didn't matter anymore. Angela was smiling, actually smiling, which was rare for her. Congratulations, she said. You both deserve this. Mrs. Pruitt hugged Nicole, and Ms. Chen was wiping her eyes. Dr. Patel gave me a nod that conveyed more than words could. Even the court reporter, a woman I'd never spoken to, caught my eye and smiled. As we left the courtroom, I saw Marcus standing near the back. He'd come after all, though I hadn't known he would be there. He met my eyes and nodded once, a gesture that seemed to carry apology and acknowledgement and maybe even a little pride. I nodded back. Outside, the June sunshine was warm and bright. Nicole tilted her face up to it, eyes closed, a smile playing at her lips. What do you want to do to celebrate? I asked. Can we get ice cream? We can get whatever you want. We drove to a small ice cream shop in Columbus that Nicole had fallen in love with, the kind of place with 50 flavors and toppings you could pile as high as you wanted. Nicole got 3 scoops with gummy bears and chocolate chips, and I got a simple vanilla cone. We sat at an outdoor table and watched people walk by, the normalcy of it feeling almost surreal after the intensity of the hearing. Rachel? Nicole said between bites. Yeah. Thank you for fighting for me. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You never have to thank me for that. You're my sister. Fighting for you isn't a favor, it's just what you do for people you love. She smiled, ice cream on her chin, looking more at peace than I'd ever seen her. In that moment, sitting in the sunshine eating ice cream after a court battle that had lasted 6 months, I realized something fundamental had shifted. I'd spent my whole life trying to earn love from people who'd never truly offered it. I'd measured my worth by how useful I could be, how quiet I could stay, how much I could give without asking for anything in return. But Nicole had taught me something different. She'd taught me that love wasn't about earning or deserving. It was about showing up, consistently and honestly, even when it was hard. It was about choosing someone else's well-being over your own comfort. It was about standing up when everyone else sat down. That evening, Kelly came over with a bottle of champagne and a cake she'd had specially made that read "Congratulations" in purple frosting. We celebrated with Nicole, toasting to new beginnings and second chances and the kind of family you choose rather than the one you're born into. After Nicole went to bed, Kelly and I sat on the couch, glasses of champagne in hand, the leftover cake on the coffee table between us. I'm really proud of you, Kelly said. You know that, right? I couldn't have done it without you, I replied. All those nights you listened to me second-guess myself. All those times you told me I wasn't crazy for seeing what I was seeing. You were never crazy, Kelly said firmly. You were right. And now Nicole has a real chance at life. That's because of you. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Kelly asked the question I'd been avoiding thinking about. So what happens with your dad now? I shook my head. I don't know. The court gave him visitation rights if Nicole wants them, but she hasn't asked. And honestly, I don't think she will. Not for a while, maybe not ever. He'd have to actually change, actually acknowledge what he did, and I don't see that happening. And Marcus? That's complicated, I admitted. He apologized, and I think he meant it. But decades of enabling don't disappear with one conversation. If he wants to rebuild a relationship with Nicole, he'll have to prove he's serious. Same with me. Fair enough, Kelly said. And what about you? How are you doing with all of this? I thought about it. Honestly, I feel lighter. Like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long that I didn't even notice the weight until it was gone. I kept waiting to feel guilty, to feel like maybe I'd been too harsh or too unforgiving. But I don't. I feel clear. Kelly raised her glass. To clarity. To clarity, I echoed, and we drank to that. The weeks that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Nicole continued to thrive at Horizons, even landing a part-time job helping at a local library, something she was incredibly proud of. She made plans with friends without needing my help, started expressing opinions about what she wanted to wear and eat and do, became more herself than she'd ever been allowed to be. I went back to my regular work schedule, no longer needing to coordinate around court dates and lawyer meetings. The firm had been supportive throughout the whole process, and my boss had even given me a small bonus with a note that said for going above and beyond in all aspects of life. About 2 months after the final hearing, I got a letter in the mail. The return address was Riverside, but it wasn't from my father. It was from Marcus. I almost threw it away without opening it, but something made me sit down at the kitchen table and read it. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten in Marcus's messy scrawl. He talked about going to therapy, about starting to understand the dysfunction we'd grown up in, about recognizing his role and perpetuating it. He talked about Dad, about how the hardware store was struggling and Dad had become bitter and isolated. He talked about regret, about all the years he'd wasted being someone he thought he was supposed to be instead of figuring out who he actually was. At the end, he wrote something that stuck with me. You showed me that it's possible to break the pattern. You chose Nicole over everyone's approval, including Dad's, including mine. That took courage I didn't think existed in our family. I'm trying to find that courage now. I don't know if I'll ever be the brother you deserved, but I want to try. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to extend an olive branch and see if Marcus was serious about changing. But another part, the part that had learned the hard way that words were easy and actions were what mattered, decided to wait. If Marcus was genuine, he'd prove it over time. And if he wasn't, well, I'd already survived losing the family I'd grown up with. I'd survive that too. Nicole asked about him occasionally, usually when something reminded her of childhood. She'd mention a game they used to play or a time he'd been kind to her, rare moments that stood out against years of neglect by association. I never discouraged her from those memories, but I also never pushed her to reach out if she wasn't ready. One evening in late summer, Nicole and I were making dinner together when she said, out of nowhere, "Do you think people can really change?" I stopped chopping vegetables and looked at her. Some people can. If they want to badly enough and if they're willing to do the work. But wanting to change and actually changing are different things. Do you think Dad could change? I considered the question carefully. Maybe. But it would require him to admit he was wrong, to take responsibility for how he treated you. And I don't think he's capable of that. His pride won't allow it. She nodded slowly. I don't miss him. Is that bad? Not even a little bit, I said. You don't owe him anything, Nicole. Not your love, not your forgiveness, not your presence in his life. Family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up for you, who makes you feel safe, who wants you to thrive. She smiled then, a genuine, unguarded smile. You showed up for me. I always will, I promised. That night, after Nicole went to bed, I stood at my window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere in Riverside, my father was living whatever life he'd constructed in the wake of losing control of Nicole. Somewhere, Marcus was trying to figure out who he was without Dad's approval. And somewhere in this apartment, Nicole was sleeping peacefully, dreaming whatever dreams people dream when they finally feel safe. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, of fear, of wondering if I was doing the right thing. There had been costs, relationships lost, a hometown I could probably never return to without judgment, a father who'd disowned me. But there had also been gains that outweighed every loss. Nicole's laughter. Her confidence. Her art displayed on our refrigerator. Her first paycheck from the library. Her friendships. Her future. And my own transformation too, the realization that I didn't need to be small or quiet or accommodating to deserve love. That standing up, even when it was terrifying, even when it cost me everything I thought I needed, was the most important thing I'd ever done. Judge Hartwell had laughed in that courtroom 6 months ago because my father's lies had been so transparent. But she'd also ruled in our favor because the truth, when you present it clearly and consistently, is undeniable. And the truth was simple. Nicole deserved better. And I'd made sure she got it. That was enough. That would always be enough. A year passed. Then another. Nicole turned 28, and we threw a party at the apartment with her friends from Horizons, Kelly, Mrs. Pruitt, and a few neighbors we'd gotten close to. She blew out the candles on a cake she'd helped decorate herself, and when everyone sang happy birthday, I saw her eyes shine with joy rather than the awkward embarrassment I remembered from childhood parties where she'd been mostly ignored. She'd grown into herself in ways I hadn't imagined possible. Her job at the library had expanded to 3 days a week, and she'd been given more responsibilities, organizing book displays and helping with children's reading programs. She'd taken up painting seriously, and several of her pieces now hung in a local gallery that featured artists from community programs. She had a best friend named Tasha who called her every evening, and they'd giggle over the phone like teenagers. Most importantly, she'd learned to advocate for herself. When something bothered her, she spoke up. When she needed help, she asked for it without apologizing. When she accomplished something, she allowed herself to feel proud. The scared, withdrawn woman who'd sat in that courtroom 2 years ago had transformed into someone confident and whole. Marcus had proven himself genuine, slowly and carefully. He'd driven up to Columbus once a month for the first year, always calling ahead, always respecting Nicole's boundaries. He'd brought small gifts, nothing extravagant, just things he thought she'd like. A book about famous painters. A warm scarf in her favorite color. Eventually, Nicole had warmed to him, and now they texted regularly. He'd even started challenging Dad's version of events with other family members, quietly correcting the narrative whenever someone repeated the lies. Dad himself remained distant, locked in whatever reality he'd constructed. The hardware store had closed 8 months after the final hearing, sold to a regional chain. He'd moved to a smaller house on the edge of town. According to Marcus, he'd become a ghost of his former self, rarely attending church or community events, spending most of his time alone. Marcus had tried to build a bridge, but Dad refused, still insisting he'd been wronged, still blaming me for destroying his reputation. I felt nothing when I heard these updates. Not satisfaction, not sadness, not even pity. Just a hollow indifference toward a man who'd chosen his pride over his daughter and would spend the rest of his life living with that choice. On a crisp October afternoon, I took Nicole to visit Mom's grave, something we did a few times a year. We brought fresh flowers and sat on the grass beside the headstone while leaves drifted down around us. Nicole traced Mom's name with her finger. "I think she'd be happy," Nicole said softly. "About how things turned out." "I think so too," I replied. "She always wanted you to be safe and loved." Nicole was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she'd be mad at you? For what you did to Dad?" I considered the question. "I don't think so. Mom spent her whole life wishing she'd been brave enough to stand up to him. She told me that near the end. I think she'd understand that sometimes protecting someone you love means disappointing someone else." We sat there until the sun started to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As we walked back to the car, Nicole slipped her hand into mine, something she still did when she felt particularly content. That evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, my phone rang. It was Angela, which was unusual. We'd stayed in touch, occasional emails and coffee meetups, but she rarely called without reason. "Rachel, I thought you should know. Your father filed an appeal 3 weeks ago. It was denied this morning." I leaned against the kitchen counter. "An appeal? After 2 years?" Angela sighed. "Apparently he got a new lawyer who convinced him he had grounds. They argued that the original ruling was based on biased testimony. It was a weak case, and the appellate court saw right through it. The ruling stands. Nicole's guardianship is secure." "Thank you for letting me know," I said. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Actually, I'm better than fine. He can file all the appeals he wants. It won't change anything." After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen and felt a wave of something I hadn't expected. Not anger or worry, but a deep, settling peace. My father's final attempt to reassert control had failed because the truth was undeniable. Nicole was flourishing. The evidence was irrefutable. And no amount of legal maneuvering could change that reality. Nicole emerged from her room with a sketch she'd been working on. "What do you think?" she asked, holding it up. It was a drawing of 2 women sitting under a tree, their faces tilted toward the sun, holding hands. The detail was remarkable, the shading careful and deliberate. "It's beautiful," I said. "Is that us?" She nodded, smiling. "I wanted to capture what it feels like. Being here with you. Being safe." I pulled her into a hug, this woman who'd survived so much and come out stronger. "Can I keep this one?" "Of course," she said. "It's yours." I hung the drawing in my bedroom that night, right where I'd see it first thing every morning. A reminder of what mattered, of what we'd built together, of the family we'd chosen to become. Years from now, people might ask if it was worth it. Worth losing a father, worth the harassment and judgment, worth the battle. And I'd tell them what I told myself on the hardest days. Every single moment of difficulty was worth it for the life Nicole has now. For her laughter, her confidence, her art, her independence. For the knowledge that she knows she's valued and loved and deserving of everything good. The letter I'd written for Judge Hartwell had been 5 pages of truth that changed everything. But the real story wasn't what happened in that courtroom. It was what happened after. It was Nicole learning to trust again. It was the 2 of us building something real and lasting. It was the quiet, ordinary moments that added up to a life worth living. That night, I stood in my hallway and looked at Nicole's closed bedroom door. Behind it, she was probably reading or sketching or texting Tasha about their plans for the weekend. She was safe. She was happy. She was exactly where she belonged. And I was too. Not because I'd won some victory over my father, but because I'd finally learned the most important lesson. You don't measure your worth by who accepts you. You measure it by who you choose to protect, who you show up for, who you love without condition. I'd chosen Nicole. And in doing so, I'd chosen myself too. Chosen a life built on truth rather than performance, on love rather than obligation, on courage rather than comfort. The judge had laughed because my father's lies were absurd in the face of reality. But the real victory wasn't his defeat. It was Nicole's freedom. It was her smile, her artwork, her voice saying I want to stay with Rachel without fear. That was the story that mattered. And it was a story that would continue long after courtrooms and hearings faded into memory. It was a story about choosing love when hate was easier, about standing up when sitting down was safer, about believing that one person's courage could change everything. Nicole was living proof that it could. That it did. That it mattered. And that would always be enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.